Hi guys, happy Monday! I am back with another Crispy and Allsburg week. It's our last week studying Crispy and Allsburg, so I hope you'll enjoy these last few stories that I have for you. Today's, I think, is another unusual one. It's kind of different from everything we've read. It's called Two Bad Ants. This one, much like the Misadventures of Sweetie Pie, has animals as our main character, and it has colored illustrations. So I chose to pair these together because I think they have some things in common. And I'd like us to think about comparing these two texts. So remember, the Misadventures of Sweetie Pie saw our hamster Sweetie Pie kind of escaping from ownership by children and making it out into the wild. So let's see what happens in Two Bad Ants. The news traveled swiftly through the tunnels of the ant world. A scout had returned with a remarkable discovery, a beautiful sparkling crystal. When the scout presented the crystal to the queen ant, she took a small bite, then quickly ate the entire thing. So Chris Van Allsburg is being a little mysterious here. Kind of like in the Wretched Stone, you had to wonder what was the stone. This one, you're wondering, what is this giant crystal? She deemed it the most delicious food she had ever tasted. Nothing could make her happier than to have more, much more. The ants understood. They were eager to gather more crystals because the queen was the mother of them all. Her happiness made the whole ant nest a happy place. It was late in the day when they departed. Long shadows stretched over the entrance to the ant kingdom. One by one, the insects climbed out, following the scout, who had made it clear there were many crystals where the first had been found, but the journey was long and dangerous. I love how everything is drawn from an ant's perspective. So what are these? They almost look like tall, tall trees, don't they? But because this is the ant's perspective, this is probably just grass. They marched into the woods that surrounded their underground home. Dusk turned to twilight, twilight to night. The path they followed twisted and turned, every bend leading them deeper into the dark forest. More than once, the line of ants stopped and anxiously listened for the sounds of hungry spiders. But all they heard was the call of crickets echoing through the woods like distant thunder. Dew formed on the leaves above. Without warning, huge cold drops fell on the marching ants. A firefly passed overhead that for an instant lit up the woods with a blinding flash of blue-green light. You ever thought about what it might be like to be an ant? I think Chris Van Allsburg invites us to do that, doesn't he? To imagine things from the perspective of something so much smaller than ourselves. It's kind of a fun thinking game. If you get bored later, you might try it. Crawl around your house and see what things would be like from the perspective of a tiny little bug. At the edge of the forest stood a mountain. The ants looked up and could not see its peak. It seemed to reach right to the heavens, but they did not stop. Up the side they climbed higher and higher. What is this mountain that they're talking about? To us, maybe those are bricks? The wind whistled through the cracks of the mountain's face. The ants could feel its force bending their delicate antennae. Their legs grew weak as they struggled upward. At last they reached a ledge and crawled through a narrow tunnel. When the ants came out of the tunnel, they found themselves in a strange world. Smells they had known all their lives, smells of dirt and grass and rotting plants, had vanished. There was no wind, and most puzzling of all, it seemed that the sky was gone. What room do you think they're in? They crossed smooth and shiny surfaces, then followed the scout up a glassy, curved wall. They had reached their goal. From the top of the wall, they looked below to see a sea of crystals. One by one, the ants climbed down into the sparkling treasure. Do you have an idea now what the sparkling treasure is, what those crystals are? Quickly, they each chose a crystal, then turned to start the journey home. There was something about this unnatural place that made the ants nervous. In fact, they left in such a hurry that none of them noticed the two small ants who stayed behind. So, look, in case you haven't figured it out, he gives us a clue. G-A-R. Maybe it's sugar. I don't know. Sorry, I had to pause. My dog kept barking. Why go back? One asked the other. This place may not feel like home, but look at these crystals. You're right, said the other. We can stay here and eat this tasty treasure every day forever. So the two ants ate crystal after crystal until they were too full to move and fell asleep. A little bit greedy, right? So because the ants were greedy, I wonder what will happen. Remember those character traits that drive the plot of our story? I bet that something's about to happen as a result or because of the ants being greedy. Let's find out. Daylight came. The sleeping ants were unaware of changes taking place in their newfound home. A giant silver scoop hovered above them, then plunged deep into the crystals. It shoveled up both ants and crystals and carried them high into the air. The ants were wide awake when the scoop turned, dropping them from a frightening height. They tumbled through space in a shower of crystals and fell into a boiling brown lake. What's the giant scoop? Spoon. What do you think is the boiling brown lake? What do you put coffee in the mornings? What do you put sugar in the morning? I bet it's a cup of coffee, right? The giant scoop stirred violently back and forth. Crushing waves fell over the ants. They paddled hard to keep their tiny heads above water, but the scoop kept spinning a hot brown liquid. I love how it's calling the little ripples in your coffee cup from stirring waves. Because to the ants, they probably do look like waves, right? Around and around it went, creating a whirlpool that sucked the ants deeper and deeper. They both held their breath and finally bobbed to the surface, gasping for air and spitting mouthfuls of the terrible, bitter water. Then the lake tilted and began to empty into a cave. What do you think the cave is? The ants could hear the rushing water and felt themselves pulled toward the pitch black. Suddenly, the cave disappeared and the lake became calm. The ants swam to the shore and found that the lake had steep sides. They hurried down the walls that held back the lake. The frightened insects looked for a place to hide, worried that the giant scoop might shovel them up again. Close by, they found a huge round disc with holes that could neatly hide them. A round disc with holes that could neatly hide them. I think it's whatever this is. I wonder what that is. But as soon as they had climbed inside, their hiding place was lifted, tilted, and lowered into a dark space. Are you picturing this? Are you closing your eyes and thinking about what it would look like? When the ants climbed out of the holes, they were surrounded by a strange red glow. It seemed that every second the temperature was rising. I think they're inside of a toaster oven. It soon became so unbearably hot that they thought they would soon be cooked. But suddenly the disc they were standing on rocketed upward, and the two hot ants went flying out through the air. So those holes, the disc with holes, was maybe an English muffin type of bread. They landed near what seemed to be a fountain, a waterfall pouring from a silver tube. Both ants had a powerful thirst and longed to dip their feverish heads into the refreshing water. They quickly climbed along the tube. As they got closer to the rushing water, the ants felt a cool spray. They tightly gripped the shiny surface of the fountain and slowly leaned their heads into the falling stream, but the force of the water was much too strong. Are these ants going to make it? Are they going to survive? Remember, none of this would have happened if these ants hadn't been so greedy for that sugar. Maybe they're even a little too curious. The tiny insects were pulled off the fountain and plunged into a wet, dark chamber. They landed on half-eaten fruit and other soggy things. Suddenly the air was filled with loud, frightening sounds. The chamber began to spin. The ants were caught in a whirling storm of shredded food and stinging rain. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise and spinning stopped. Bruised and dizzy, the ants climbed out of the chamber. What is that space? Maybe the garbage disposal, I think. In daylight, once again, they raced through puddles and up a smooth metal wall. In the distance, they saw something comforting. 2 long, narrow holes that reminded them of the warmth and safety of their old underground home. They crawled up into the dark openings. What is this? It gives you a clue here. But there was no safety inside these holes. A strange force passed through the wet ants. They were stunned senseless and blown out of the holes like bullets from a gun. When they landed, the tiny insects were too exhausted to go on. They've been electrocuted, haven't they? They crawled into a dark corner and fell fast asleep. That's why we don't touch those electric plug-ins, right? Night had returned when the battered ants woke up to a familiar sound. The footsteps of their fellow insects returning for more crystals. 2 ants slipped quietly to the end of the line. They climbed a glassy wall and once again stood amid the treasure. But this time they each chose a single crystal and followed their friends home. Standing at the edge of their ant hole, the 2 ants listened to the joyful sounds that came from below. They knew how grateful their mother queen would be when they gave her their crystals. At that moment, the 2 ants felt happier than they'd ever felt before. This was their home. This was their family. This was where they were meant to be. So the way Chris Van Allsburg does mystery in this book is a lot different than the way we saw it in something like The Widow's Broom. This one kind of, the mystery is on each page, right? Trying to figure out what the different objects he's talking about actually are in our world. So I think that's really interesting. It's a different way of doing that mysterious feel, but it still feels very Chris Van Allsburg, doesn't it? Kind of the mystery, maybe even a little creepy kind of feel to it. That's very him. So here's a couple things I think you could do. You do not have to do these things, but I know some of you have told me you're feeling a little bored at home. Here are 2 projects that I always think would be really fun when I finish this book. The first project is to think about things from the perspective of an ant. So maybe you even get down on the floor and you kind of crawl around looking at things like, if I were tiny, what would that look like way up there? Then you could either write about it, kind of like Chris Van Allsburg is able to describe a wall as being a mountain. He describes that cup of coffee like a churning sea. So you could try to use words to describe the situation that you find yourself in as a pretend ant. Or I think it would be really cool to try to draw it. What does something look like from the perspective of something tiny? And draw that illustration. What would an apple look like? What would a refrigerator look like? What would the tree out back look like from the perspective of a tiny little ant? Those are two things that I think could be fun to do with your afternoon, just if you needed ideas. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day. I will see you later.